First, you need to put your truck on jack stands and remove the wheel of whatever side you're working on. We are going to start with the driver's side first. Once that's removed and out of the way, look for these two bolts. One is an 8mm and the other is a 10mm. Those need to be removed to give yourself some slack in the ABS line. This is your IWE vacuum line, which will need to be disconnected from the IWE. Oh, and in case you were wondering, IWE stands for Integrated Wheel End. This line runs from your ABS wheel speed sensor in your wheel bearing up this way to the top of the wheel liner, and we will remove that later in the video. And yes, if you purchase new wheel bearings, they do come with this line, so you don't have to remove the sensor itself. Let's start with a 10mm bolt that holds the brake hose bracket in place. This will give you plenty of room to push that brake caliper out of the way after removing it. Alright, that bolt is off and now you should be able to pull the bracket out. Do you see this part of the bracket that extends out? This helps hold the line in place when we put everything back together. I'll show you what I mean later in the video. Push that out of the way and then get ready to disconnect the bolt for the ABS line. This is an 8mm. For this bolt, I'm going to use an open-ended wrench. You can use a socket, however, it's difficult to get one in there because of how close this rubber clamp is to the bolt. Once that is free, the line will have more slack in it just like this. Let's get this cap removed so we can have access to the axle nut. You want to keep moving around the cap while rocking the channel locks back and forth. Eventually, the cap will come loose and pop right out. Just like that. Now let's remove that axle nut. This is a 13mm bolt and I recommend using a deep socket like this so you don't hit the wheel studs while turning your wrench. Also, the wheel tends to turn with the axle nut as you are trying to loosen it. So I recommend hitting your wrench with the palm of your hand a few times in the counterclockwise direction. This should loosen it a little at a time until you can grab the top of the rotor to hold it in place as you loosen the nut the rest of the way. Eventually it will loosen to the point where you can unscrew it by hand and remove it. Just like that. You will notice the inside nut has red Loctite on the threads. Make sure your new nut has it too, as this will prevent the nut from loosening over time, which could cause severe damage to parts around this area. Now let's move on and get the caliper out of the way. I'm going to remove the caliper as one unit by removing these two bolts for the caliper mounting bracket. These are 21mm. Make sure you start with the lower bolt first or else the caliper will move too much at the top, making it difficult to keep it stable while removing the bottom bolt due to the weight of the caliper. Once that's removed, we can move on to the top bolt. Now you do not want to completely remove this bolt until you find an area to rest the caliper or until you are ready to mount the caliper out of the way safely without it dangling from the brake hose. So I rested the caliper on the top of the hub and removed the rotor. Make sure you rest the rotor on something soft if you plan on reusing them. Now back to hanging the caliper. Here is how it looks at this stage. As you can see, with this bracket detached from the mounting point, we have enough slack in the brake hose to push the caliper as far back as possible. This gives us plenty of room to get to the parts we need to remove. But I do not like the way the caliper looks with one bungee cord. So here is a revision I did off camera. As you can see, I have both of these hooks securing the caliper to the sway bar back here. This provides plenty of support as it does not move very much. Now let's remove the tie rod nut so our hub can freely move side to side. This is a 21mm. You might as well remove it all the way with your socket wrench or your impact because it will be too difficult to remove by hand due to the Loctite used from the factory. Once that's out of the way, you can grab a sledgehammer or a regular hammer and start hitting right here. This should technically help break the tie rod free. However, as you can see, my tie rod wanted to be a little difficult. I grabbed some penetrating fluid and sprayed right here where the bushing meets the hub. I also sprayed the threads underneath the knuckle, however, I'm not sure that did a lot. The fluid on top I believe was the most helpful. I'm going to let that soak in for a bit, but I want you to take note of the wheel position. Now the wheel is turned the other way as I needed more access to these bolts. I'll show you why that is important in a second. Let's get those IWE bolts removed. These are 8mm. After that's removed, you can move on to the second of the 3 IWE bolts. But wait, now the tie rod is popped out of place. I believe it popped when I turned the wheel when trying to access that IWE bolt. Let's get the other 2 IWE bolts out of the way. This is where both of them are located, and remember they are 8mm. That's the second bolt. And there's the third. Now you have to pull the vacuum line out of the IWE and it's completely free. Well, sort of. You need to remove the upper control arm nut so you can move the hub away from the axle. Here's the nut. These are also known as an insulator nut, and the reason for that is because they come with a plastic ring at the end to help keep the bolt from backing out. Here's a picture of a brand new nut from Ford. See that red ring at the end? That's what I'm referring to. That plastic piece is what makes removing that upper control arm nut so difficult. It's also why I was able to remove it after using heat, because I essentially melted the plastic and unscrewed it before it cooled off and became solid again. Let's keep going. Next, you want to get that ABS line loose and disconnected so you can completely remove the wheel bearing. So grab some kind of clip removal tool like this one and disconnect the line right here. Now on the center edge of your fender well, you will notice two white pins sticking out. You need to push these in or pull down on the electrical connector behind it just like that. There is a red tab you need to push out before you can disconnect. So grab your clip removal tool again, or even push it out with a fingernail if you can. Then you can disconnect the connector by pressing on this tab right here and then pulling them apart, just like that. The tab is right under this red clip. All you do is press down, pretty simple. Then you want to feed this wire through or pull it out of this area. Since the upper control arm is disconnected from the hub assembly, you can easily pull it towards you like this and then push the IWE and CV axle to free them. Then the IWE should easily slide off of the CV axle like this. Alright, let's grab the new IWE and compare it to the old one to make sure we have the right one. As you can see, it comes pre-greased from Ford, which is great. Also, it comes with new IWE 8mm bolts and a new axle nut. Now, if you were just replacing the IWE, you need to wipe down this end of the axle to remove the old grease. This is important because the old grease probably has a lot of dirt and other debris stuck in there that you really want to clean up to prevent from damaging your brand new IWE. I'm replacing my axle, but I still wanted to mention that. Now, grab your grease and you're going to want to apply it to the wheel bearing and your CV axle. Your new IWE will be sandwiched between these two parts, and since it already comes greased from Ford, you don't need to apply a lot of grease. Just a coating over the ends to ensure everything stays greased up while in operation. Once that's done, you can grab your IWE and make sure it's in the correct orientation. You want the nipples to face towards the vehicle, not out like you see here. Watch what happens when you have it facing the wrong way. Two things. First, it would be difficult to connect the vacuum line to the nipples. And secondly, you won't be able to mount it because the three 8mm bolts will not be able to reach the hub with the IWE out this far. So pull it back out, mount the IWE properly, and then push it back together. Okay, so while you are working on the next step, you need to find a way to keep the hub assembly from falling towards you. Since that upper control arm nut is out, it will naturally fall forward. So you can use a bungee, or you can temporarily put that nut back on the upper control arm ball joint to hold it into place. Now, grab some thread locker and apply it to each of the three bolts before you start screwing them in. Again, this is a high vibration area and you don't want these bolts to back out. Then grab your 8mm socket and your torque wrench. Now, I read online these need to be torqued down to 133 inch-pounds. However, my Chilton's manual reads 108 inch-pounds. So I'm going with 108 inch-pounds for now. If I need to go to 133, then I can always tighten them later. I don't want to risk going higher and being wrong, as this could break the bolts. Oh, and make sure you are using inch-pounds and not foot-pounds. 108 foot-pounds would definitely break them. The first two bolts, I'm going to just get them flush with the IWE. Then the third bolt, I will torque down and do the same with the other two. When torquing down, you want to go slow. If you try to speed through it with a smaller torque wrench like this, it may not register and then you could end up over torquing the bolts. There's one. There's two. And let's move over to the other side and torque the third bolt down. Just like that. Alright, let's move on to the upper control arm nut. You need to use a pry bar or something similar to allow you to press the control arm down like this. This gives you the leverage needed to line up the hub assembly and get that nut screwed on. As I stated near the beginning of this video, it is required to replace this nut on both sides due to that red plastic piece that melted off when I was using a torch. I am installing the old ones, but I had to go back to Ford to get new nuts to replace later on. Make sure the pry bar is secure and doesn't come out like mine just did. Luckily, this did not cause any damage or injury, but it can fly out, so just be careful. With the pry bar secure against the spring, I was able to easily pull down and then screw the nut on. Now we can tighten the nut. Ford calls for this to be torqued down to 85 foot-pounds. However, that would be quite difficult to do since I don't have a 21mm open-ended wrench, so I'm just going to use my impact. Plus, I need to replace this bolt with a new one anyway. If you have a 21mm open-ended wrench, you need to wedge it up against the hub assembly right here while it's on the nut. Then you should be able to use a torque wrench with a socket and tighten from the bottom. I think that would be the best way to tackle that, but if you have a different idea, let me know in the comments and I'll add it to the description. Next, we need to grab one of our new axle nuts and begin screwing it onto the end of the axle that's poking through the center of the wheel bearing. Now we need to torque this nut down to 30 foot-pounds. While you are turning the axle nut, you will notice at some point the bearing begins to turn also, just like this. Now, some people I've watched online will use a pry bar and wedge it between the wheel studs to keep it from moving. I personally don't like this idea because, as you may have guessed, you could damage the threads on the studs. So I decided to hold onto the studs while using a torque wrench with one hand. If you are unable to do this, you can ask someone to hold it, or if you have no other choice and need to use something like a pry bar, just make sure you wrap the threads completely with a towel, like a microfiber, to hopefully prevent prevent any damage to the wheel studs. That can be done if you are very careful, but avoid it if you can. Alright, let's move on to something that is not necessary at all. I'm going to grab some grease and apply a decent amount around the axle nut. I'm not sure if I read somewhere this needed to be done, or if I was just used to doing it on older vehicles like my OBS F150, but I do know this can help keep moisture out, so I figured why not. Once that's done, we can move on to installing the cap. This is fairly simple, however, you need to pay attention to how you install it. You want to make sure it's perfectly straight before you start hammering it into place. You can use a mallet or a hammer, it doesn't really matter. Just make sure it's straight or else you may damage the inside edge, which would make it difficult for it to securely stay in place. This is how it should look when it's installed correctly. Now we just need to clean it up a bit and then we can move on. We will get to the rotor in a second, but I want to mention now is a good time to put thread locker on the caliper bolts. If you try to do this while holding the caliper in place, you will find it quite difficult. These calipers are heavy and will move around on you, so it's best to be prepared before you get to it. Alright, let's apply our anti-seize to the hub surface to prevent the rotor from sticking the next time we have to remove it. You just want a light coat and do not add any to the wheel studs. If you get some on them, just wipe it off with a rag or a towel. Once that's completely covered, you can grab your rotor and push it over the wheel studs. Then grab your anti-seize again and apply it to this part of the rotor. You do not want to get any on the surface that your brake pads touch. This will make it difficult to stop, as you can imagine. Again, just a light coat is all you need. And if you get any on the wheel studs like I did, just go ahead, like I said earlier, wipe it off. Alright, now we need to get that caliper back on. Make sure you put one lug nut on to help keep the rotor in place to make this easier. I'll show you what I mean. Oh, and do not press on the surface of the rotor or else you will get anti-seize everywhere. As you can see, trying to keep that rotor pressed back while installing the caliper is a chore. You really need to use two hands to handle the caliper, which is why screwing on one lug nut is such a convenient idea. It will prevent that rotor from moving, which is exactly what you want. Eventually, I was able to get the caliper lined up with the bracket and started threading the bolts in. Remember, if you haven't added thread locker to these bolts yet, make sure you do so. Once they are threaded in, you can torque these down to 184 foot-pounds. I just use my impact to tighten these bolts because I'm pretty sure my torque wrench is broken or needs to be recalibrated. Now we can connect that 10mm bolt for our brake hose bracket. Then grab your 10mm socket and snug it down. Just like that. Next is your ABS line. So grab that and see if it reaches the bracket that it screws into. If it doesn't, like mine, then it's snagged onto something and you need to free it. Mine was snagged on the brake dust shield. Once I was able to free it, it gave me just enough slack to get that 8mm bolt finger tight. Then you can grab your socket and snug it down. Now you can grab the wire and connect it to the connector up top. After it's connected, go ahead and push in those two white clips through the fender liner just like this. Alright, so as you can see, the footage is rather dark at this angle, so I'm just going to fast forward this part and then I will show you exactly where the wire needs to be clipped into. Now as I grab the camera, you will see the first clip gets pushed into this bracket and the other clip gets pushed in right here. This is how the wire should look, but you can also take a picture of the stock setup before starting this job so you can use it as a reference. Let's move on and get that tie rod nut back on. Just grab your tie rod and then maneuver the hub assembly to allow the tie rod end to slot into place, just like that. Make sure you add some thread locker onto the threads too. Then grab your 21mm deep socket and torque this nut down to 85 foot-pounds. Now we can reconnect the IWE vacuum hose. Take note, there are two different size holes in the hose as you can see right here. This is to prevent you from putting it on in reverse. So go ahead and push it on. Then grab the clip for the hose right here and push it into the bracket just like this. You can now put your wheel back on. Make sure you tighten the lug nuts in a crisscross pattern and then torque them down to 125 foot-pounds. Finally, you can lower your truck and then turn the wheel all the way to the left if you plan on working on the passenger side next. I already jacked up my truck and removed the wheel, so let's start by disconnecting the IWE vacuum hose. Just pull it off. Then we can begin working on that ABS line. Start with an 8mm wrench like this one. I tried to use the closed end, but it was too tight and won't fit, so use the open end to start. Then you can use the closed end to speed up the process if you have a set of ratcheting wrenches like these. These come in handy and I will link them down in the description below. Once that bolt is removed, you can grab a 10mm socket and get to work on the bolt that holds this bracket in place. Remove the bolt and then you should be able to pull the bracket out. Now grab your panel removal tool and use it on the two clips for your ABS line. Then we can move up to the fender liner and pull the connector out, just like that. Make sure you push the red locking tab out first before you try to disconnect it. Perfect. Then you want to push right here and pull the connectors apart. Next you want to pull the wire away from everything so it won't be in your way as you are removing parts. This part just pulls right out. Now we can begin working on the brake caliper. So grab your 21mm socket and loosen the 2 caliper bracket bolts. Don't remove the top bolt all the way, as you don't want the caliper to fall after you remove the bottom bolt. This could put too much stress on the brake hose, which can cause leaks. And you want to make sure it's the top bolt that is left in, because if you leave the bottom bolt in, the caliper will still swing from top to bottom. So leave the top bolt in until you are ready to remove the whole unit. Once the bottom bolt is completely removed, you can get ready to remove the top bolt. But there are 2 things you want to do first. You want to give the caliper a twist like this. This will help push the brake pads in just enough so it's easier to pull off the rotor, which will also help a ton when you're ready to put the caliper back on. The next thing you want to do is get your caliper S-hook or whatever you are using to secure the caliper ready. The caliper has some weight to it, so try to get as prepared as you can to make this easier on you. If you have an S-hook, it should fit perfectly into the frame hole right here. My strap hooks did not fit, so I had to find another location. You can't see it right now because of the camera angle, but I hooked it around the upper control arm and it worked great. I'll show you that later. Let's remove the nut for the outer tie rod. This is a 21mm. Having an impact in this situation helps a ton. You will notice some resistance as the nut gets closer to coming off. Just keep turning. Alright, here comes the fun part. You need to separate the tie rod from the hub. So grab your penetrating fluid and try to spray around the bushing like this, and then spray upwards on the threads. Now let it set for a few minutes and then we can try to free it. Of course, this part isn't in the camera's view, but you can see me hitting this part of the hub. This separated it perfectly. Now you just need to give it a couple of whacks and the tie rod is now completely free. Let's move on. Grab your 8mm socket and begin removing the 3 IWE bolts. There's 1. And there's 2. Now let me change the camera angles real quick. There we go. Here's the 3rd and final bolt that holds the IWE to the hub. Go ahead and remove that. And now we can move on to that dreaded upper control arm nut. Grab your 21mm deep socket and try to remove the nut all the way. This is possible to do as long as it doesn't separate, but mine just separated. So learning from the driver's side, I'm going to grab the torch and immediately start heating that nut. Once I feel it's hot enough, I grab my 10mm socket for the bottom and use my channel locks to turn that nut, just like this. At some point it may stop turning. That just means you need more heat. And you may have to do this a few times before it completely comes off. So, apply more heat. Eventually you will feel less resistance when turning, and that means the nut is almost at the end. So at this point I decided to grab my impact and finish it off. Just like that. Now you can pull the hub assembly away from the upper control arm, and that will give you full access to the IWE and the axle. Then you can pull up on the IWE and the axle at the same time to get it away from the hub. The IWE can then pull off of the axle. Now we can grab our grease again and begin greasing the teeth at the end of our axle. Go ahead and apply it on the outside as well as the inside of the teeth. Once that's done, you can grab your IWE and place it with the 2 vacuum nipples facing toward the vehicle. Go ahead and push it on and make sure the teeth lock into the teeth of the axle. Just like that. Now grab your hardware for the IWE. I bought new bolts and a new axle nut from Ford. It wasn't too expensive, and I'm glad I did since one of the old bolts is still stuck in the piece of the IWE that broke off. Now add some thread locker onto the bolt and then thread the bolt into place. Then do the same with the second bolt. Once my arm is out of the way, I'll show you where this bolt is. There we go. This is the top bolt. Now do the same with the 3rd and final bolt. Perfect. Then you can grab your 8mm socket and begin tightening them down, but not too much. Just enough to make them snug before we can grab our torque wrench. Now I read online these need to be torqued down to 133 inch-pounds, while my Chilton's manual reads 108 inch-pounds. So I'm going with 108 inch-pounds for now. If I need to go to 133, then I can always tighten them later. I do not want to risk going higher and being wrong, as this could break the bolts. Okay, so now we need to grab our torque wrench and torque these bolts down. Alright, once those are done, we can start working on that upper control arm nut. You could have probably just done this instead of using a bungee, to be completely honest. This is going to take some effort, but you want to pull down on the top of the control arm. Using the pry bar would make this a lot easier. Then you can thread the nut on. As I stated earlier, make sure you are using brand new nuts. Do not reuse the old ones. Now Ford calls for this to be torqued down to 85 foot-pounds. However, that would be quite difficult to do since I don't have a 21mm open-ended wrench. So I'm just going to use my impact. I'll show you what to do if you have a torque wrench in a minute. I'm going to use an impact to get the bolt started after finger tightening it. Then I'll grab my pry bar and pull down on the control arm. This allowed me to use the impact the rest of the way. Perfect. Okay, so if you have a 21mm open-ended wrench, you will need to wedge it up against the spring right here while it's on the nut. Then you should be able to use a torque wrench with the socket and tighten from the bottom. I think that would be the best way to tackle that, but if you have a different idea, let me know in the comments below and I'll add it to the description. If you used a bungee to hold the hub assembly in place, go ahead and remove it now. Let's move on to the axle nut. As you can see, there is red thread locker on these nuts already. Why is this important information, you may ask? Because for some reason, I added more thread locker to this one. I think the heat started to get to me, but you can see the red thread locker in the threads of the nut already. So this is completely unnecessary. Go ahead and screw the axle nut on by hand until it won't screw anymore. Then you can grab your 13mm deep socket and begin tightening it down. You want to use a deep socket to prevent from hitting those wheel studs. Then you can grab your torque wrench and tighten it down to 30 foot-pounds. Eventually the wheel bearing will start turning with the wrench, so grab a stud with one hand as you pull in your torque wrench with the other. Just like that. Now we can move on to the tie rod. Go ahead and line it up and push it into place. Okay, so I'm adding thread locker to this nut, but that's because I did not know these needed to be replaced after taking off, which I had to do later on. So I just wanted to get this on and secure it until I got new ones from Ford. But I want to make this clear, you do not need to add thread locker to this nut or the upper controller nut. You do, however, need to replace both. The torque spec for this nut is 85 foot-pounds. Now this part is completely unnecessary, but in order to prevent any kind of moisture from rusting out the parts inside, I decided to add some grease around the axle nut. I'm thinking this helps, however I could be completely wrong. So you do what you want with this. Now you can install your cap. Make sure it's as straight as possible before hitting it with a hammer or a mallet. That looks good. I'm going to wipe off the rest of the grease and then we can move on. Alright, go ahead and screw a lug nut all the way on to keep the rotor from moving around while installing the caliper. Then grab your caliper and place it over the rotor. You may need to give the back of the caliper a few jabs, just make sure it's lined up perfectly. Now you can grab your bolt and hopefully you already put thread locker on it before mounting the caliper, like me. This looks easy because the caliper isn't moving around, but try to remember to add thread locker before grabbing the caliper so you can immediately start threading it in. These calipers have some weight to them. Go ahead and thread the bolt in as far as you can with your fingers and then you can torque them down to 184 foot-pounds using your 21mm socket. Perfect. Now you can grab your brake hose bracket and put it into the middle slot, just like that. Then you can grab the bigger of the two bolts remaining and add some thread locker to it. Finger tighten it. And then grab your 10mm socket and snug it down. That should be good. Next, grab your ABS line and put this part in the hook. This will keep the line in place as you get that 8mm bolt installed. I added some thread locker to this bolt as well, but it's probably not necessary. Go ahead and grab your 8mm socket and snug it down as well. Perfect. Now we can remove any bungees or straps we still have and then grab our ABS line and first insert the tab into here. There is another tab you need to push in this area and you may need to filter the wire around to make it work. Then you can insert the connector into one end and then press in the red tab. Once that's connected, go ahead and press those two white tabs back through the other side of the fender liner, just like that. Next, reattach your IWE vacuum line. This should just push right in, but make sure the larger hole and smaller hole line up with the male ends of the IWE. And then you can press the tab back into the bracket. My tab is broken as you can see, but it still holds. Now you need to apply a thin coat of anti-seize to the face of the rotor, being careful not to get any on the surface that the brake pads come in contact with. All that's left is to get your wheel back on and torque down the lug nuts to 125 foot-pounds. That's all there is to it. If you found any part of this video helpful or entertaining, please give it a thumbs up. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button as well as the notification bell so you don't miss a video from our channel. Thanks for watching and we'll see you on the next one.